I was standing in our kitchen in Palo Alto, 6 months pregnant, when the lie finally spoke out loud. Even now, years later, I can still place myself there. The light was fading to that soft California gold, the air smelled like grilled chicken, and my lower back ached the way it does when your body is working overtime. Richard was behind me at the table, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, looking every bit the successful man strangers assumed he was. Richard Hayes was also deaf. That was the story anyway. Deaf since a motorcycle accident 5 years before I met him. Deaf in a way that shaped everything, how we communicated, how we planned our days, how we built tenderness out of silence. We wrote notes. We signed. We learned to read each other's lips. I had even taken classes, night after night, so my hands could speak for my heart. That evening, I did what I always did. I grabbed a pen and a sticky note. Red or white? I held it over my shoulder without turning fully, my belly making every movement feel slower. I expected him to take the note, read it, and answer with a smile or a quick sign. Instead, I heard a voice right behind me say, "Margaret, we need to talk." For a second, I thought it was the television in another room. I thought it was a neighbor. I thought my pregnancy brain was playing tricks on me. Then I turned and watched Richard's mouth move again, sounds coming out. Real words, smooth and clear. "What did you just say?" I asked. His eyes didn't leave mine. He looked frightened, but not confused. "I'm not deaf," he said. "I never was. I didn't scream, I didn't faint. I simply felt something inside me go cold." My hand went straight to my stomach, protective without thinking. The baby kicked once, and I remember the strange detail of that, life insisting on itself while my own reality split open. That was the night my marriage turned into a nightmare. If you want to understand how I ended up in that kitchen, pregnant, exhausted, holding a note meant for a man who wasn't who he claimed to be, you have to go back to the beginning. In 1991, I was 32 years old, single, and living in a cramped studio apartment I could barely afford. I was an architect, proud of the title and the work behind it. My weeks were long, my deadlines unforgiving, and my evenings quiet in a way that felt fine until it didn't. I had built a life that looked stable from the outside, but inside I carried a small, constant question. Is this enough? The world had opinions about women like me back then. People talked about having it all, but they measured you by the parts you hadn't collected yet. At family gatherings, relatives would compliment my career and then immediately ask, "So, anyone special?" As if my work, my independence, my plans, all of it was a waiting room until marriage arrived. My mother was the loudest voice in that chorus. She called every Sunday like clockwork. I could set my watch to her timing. "Margaret," she'd say, and I could picture her at the kitchen table where I grew up, coffee in hand, ready with her weekly report. "You know your cousin Daniel is engaged. And remember Amy? You two used to play together. She's 26, and she's already planning her wedding." I would stare out my window, watching fog curl along the streetlights, and try to keep my tone neutral. "Mom, I'm busy. I have work." But she didn't let go. "Work won't keep you warm," she would say. Or, "A woman shouldn't be alone forever." Sometimes she tried gentler words, concern dressed up as advice, but it always came back to the same message. Time was passing, and she didn't like what it said about me. The truth is, she wasn't wrong about one thing. I was tired of being the only single person at the table, tired of pretending the comments didn't bother me, tired of coming home to an empty apartment and telling myself it was freedom when it felt like a door closing. So when my mother mentioned a man named Richard Hayes, I didn't hang up. "This isn't another blind date," she insisted before I could protest. "This is different. He's special, Margaret." She told me he was successful, something in computer software, the kind of work that was starting to change the Bay Area in those years. She told me he was handsome, well-mannered, from a good family. Then her voice softened, and I knew she was about to reveal the part she thought would scare me. "He had a motorcycle accident," she said. "A few years ago, he lost his hearing. Completely. But he's learned to adapt. He reads lips beautifully, and he knows sign language. His mother, Dorothy, says he's quieter now. A lot of women don't want to deal with that. There was a pause. My mother always paused when she believed she was being wise. But you might be different, she continued. You've always been kind. You've always been patient. Maybe you would see him for who he is. I remember holding the phone and looking at my own reflection in the dark window. 32. A good job. A life that made sense on paper. And yet, something in me responded to the idea of a man who would have to pay attention, who couldn't talk over me, who would meet me in that deliberate quiet I'd grown used to living with. Okay, I said finally. One dinner. I told myself it was harmless. A meal, a conversation on paper, a chance to meet someone my mother had been praising for weeks. If it felt wrong, I could walk away. If it felt right, maybe, just maybe, I could stop feeling like I was always bracing myself against the next question at the next family gathering. I didn't know then what I had just agreed to. I only knew that for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of hope, bright enough to ignore the shadows gathering at the edges of the story. The dinner was set for a Friday night, which meant I spent the entire week pretending I wasn't thinking about it, while secretly thinking about it every time I caught my own reflection in an office window. Back then, going on a date at 32 felt different than it did at 22. At 22, you went out because you were curious. At 32, people acted as if you were interviewing for the rest of your life. Even friends who meant well would say things like, "So? Is he marriage material?" As if you could decide that over one plate of pasta. I told myself I wasn't desperate. I told myself I was simply open-minded. But the truth is, loneliness doesn't always announce itself with tears and dramatic speeches. Sometimes it shows up as a quiet acceptance, a willingness to say yes to things you might have said no to before, just to see if your life could feel less empty. On the morning of the dinner, my mother called again. Of course she did. "Don't wear anything too modern," she advised. "Men like a woman who looks like a woman." "Mom," I sighed, holding the phone between my shoulder and ear while I sifted through drawings on my desk. "It's just dinner." "It's not just dinner," she said, as if she'd been waiting for that exact line. "This could be your future, and remember, he's been through so much. Be gentle. Be gentle." The phrase followed me through the day like a scent. It suggested that I was walking into something fragile, something that required careful handling. It also suggested, without saying it outright, that if the evening went poorly, the blame might belong to me. That night, I chose a simple navy dress and a cardigan. Nothing flashy. I pinned my hair back the way my mother liked, even though I told myself I was doing it for convenience. I arrived at the restaurant early, an Italian place in Menlo Park with low lighting and white tablecloths that tried to make everything feel important. When I saw him, my first thought was, oh. Richard Hayes was taller than I expected, with dark hair that fell neatly into place without seeming overly styled. His suit looked expensive, but not loud. He stood when I approached the table, and the smile he offered was polite and cautious, like a man who had learned not to assume people would stay. Dorothy was with him. I hadn't realized she would be there. She rose quickly, her hands fluttering with anxious energy, and greeted me with the warmth of someone who had already decided to like me. "Margaret," she said, clasping my hands as though we were old friends. "Thank you for coming. You have no idea what this means." Her eyes shone with something close to relief. I remember feeling a small pinch of sympathy then, like I had stepped into a family's ongoing struggle, and they were hoping I could help carry it. Richard pulled out my chair and waited for me to sit before he sat himself. Then carefully, he took out a small notepad and a pen. He wrote something, slid it toward me, and looked at my face as if reading not only my lips, but my mood. It said, "Hello, Margaret. I'm glad you came." I wrote back, "Hello. Thank you for inviting me." It was odd at first, this conversation on paper, but after a few exchanges, something else happened. The pace slowed down. There was no interrupting, no rushing to fill silence. Each sentence mattered because it required effort. For the first time in a long time, I felt listened to, not just politely, but deeply. Dorothy spoke more than either of us. She explained Richard's work in software, how he was part of the wave of companies growing in the valley. She explained his accident, his recovery, how brave he was. She explained in a softer voice how hard dating had been for him since then. I watched Richard as she talked. He kept his eyes lowered when she mentioned the accident, as if he carried shame about it. When Dorothy reached for his hand, he allowed it, but he didn't lean into her. There was something guarded in him, something that made me think he had been hurt, not just physically, but emotionally. And I admit that tenderness in me, my instinct to protect, to understand, leaned toward him. At one point, Dorothy excused herself to use the restroom. The table grew quiet. Richard wrote again, more slowly this time, as if choosing each word with care. People treat me like I'm broken. I'm not, but I get tired. I stared at the sentence. I could almost hear his voice inside my head, even though, at the time, I believed he couldn't speak. I wrote back honestly, "I'm sorry. That must be exhausting." He met my eyes and gave a small nod, the kind of nod that says, "Yes, you understand." We spoke about my work. He asked what I loved about architecture, and I wrote about how buildings shape people's lives, how space can hold memory. He wrote about how he missed music, but he still loved rhythm, how he could feel it through floors at concerts. It was the kind of detail that made his story feel real. When Dorothy returned, she looked at the two of us and smiled like a woman watching a prayer get answered. By the end of the meal, I realized something. I had laughed. Not out of politeness, not out of nerves, but genuinely. The evening hadn't felt like an interview. It had felt like a slow opening, like a door that hadn't been slammed in my face for once. Outside the restaurant, the air was cool, and the streetlights cast halos on the pavement. Dorothy hugged me too tightly and whispered, "Thank you," again. Richard didn't hug me. He simply handed me one last note. "Would you like to see me again?" I stood there with the paper in my hand, looking at him, a man who seemed calm on the outside, but whose eyes held an unmistakable fear of rejection. And I thought of my empty apartment. I thought of my mother's voice. I thought of that rare feeling at dinner, being heard. So I wrote back, "Yes, I would." I didn't know then that I had just stepped onto a path that would lead me to a kitchen in Palo Alto, holding a sticky note that would become a monument to betrayal. After that first dinner, Richard and I fell into a rhythm that felt oddly natural, like two people learning a language that belonged only to them. We didn't talk on the phone, of course. Instead, he called my apartment through a relay service where an operator would type what he signed and then read my words back to him. It sounds clunky now, but at the time it felt almost charming, like love required intention. You couldn't mumble. You couldn't hide behind small talk. Every message had to be chosen, typed, delivered. In 1991, the world was changing in quiet ways. The Americans with Disabilities Act had just been signed the year before, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw ramps appearing in places that never had them, and captions starting to show up on televisions in public spaces. People talked about inclusion as if it were a new idea, and maybe it was. But what most people didn't talk about was the loneliness that can come from being treated like your life is a special circumstance. Richard carried that kind of loneliness like an extra layer of clothing, something he wore because the world required it. Our dates were simple. Sometimes we met for coffee at a small cafe where the baristas knew me by name. Sometimes we went for long walks along quiet streets lined with trees, the kind of neighborhoods where you could almost forget the noise of the valley and its hunger for the next big thing. When we went to restaurants, we sat where the light was good so he could read lips easily. I learned to face him when I spoke. I learned to slow down. And I learned, in the most surprising way, how peaceful it can be when a man can't fill every silence with words. Richard was attentive. He would watch my face closely, and not in the way some men do, watching only long enough to decide when they could speak again. He watched like he wanted to understand. When I told him about a difficult client at work, he didn't rush to solve it. He simply listened, then wrote, "I'm sorry that happened, you didn't deserve that." And I remember thinking, this is what it feels like to be cared for. Dorothy, his mother, stayed close. Sometimes she joined us. Sometimes she called me just to check in, but her check-ins always carried a hopeful edge, like she couldn't quite believe her son's life was finally moving forward. One afternoon she invited me to their home for tea. It was a tidy place in a quiet neighborhood, with family photographs framed carefully along the hallway. There were pictures of Richard as a child, smiling, holding a baseball glove, standing beside a birthday cake with too many candles to count. Dorothy pointed to those pictures with a tenderness that made me ache. "He was so lively before," she said, her voice dropping. "After the accident, it changed everything. Not just his hearing, his confidence, his trust. People can be so cruel without even meaning to be." Richard sat nearby, reading our faces as we spoke. Dorothy reached out and brushed his shoulder, and he accepted it with the patience of a son who loved his mother but had learned to carry his own pain privately. Later, when Dorothy stepped into the kitchen, Richard slid a note to me. "Thank you for being kind to her." I wrote back, "She loves you very much." His eyes softened, and for a moment I saw something raw underneath his composed exterior. Something like grief. That was when I decided I was going to try harder, not just to date him, but to truly meet him where he lived. I enrolled in a sign language class at a community center. The room smelled like dry erase markers and old carpet, and the teacher, a cheerful woman with quick hands, made us practice in front of each other until my fingers felt like strangers. The first time I tried to sign a full sentence to Richard, I messed it up so badly he laughed, shoulders shaking. His laughter was silent, but it warmed the space between us. "You're trying," he wrote, still smiling. "That matters?" So I kept trying. Some evenings after work, I would sit at my kitchen table surrounded by flashcards, practicing signs for simple words. Home, safe, trust, love. It felt awkward and earnest, like learning a child's language, but slowly my hands began to remember. I started to sign hello without thinking. I could ask how his day was. I could say I missed him. In those months, my mother became miraculously less sharp. When I told her things were going well, she sounded pleased, almost triumphant. I didn't like the feeling of being a trophy, but I was too relieved by her gentler tone to argue. "You see," she said, "sometimes you just have to listen to your mother." It's strange, the way families rewrite your choices as their victories. But at that time, I was willing to let her have it, if it meant peace. Richard and I began to share more of our histories. He wrote about a girlfriend he'd had before the accident, someone named Julia. He never wrote much, just that it ended badly and left him wary. I wrote about my father's quiet steadiness, and how losing him had made my mother cling harder to the idea of a proper life. I wrote about my fear of turning into a person who looked successful but felt empty. And in that slow exchange of truths, I started to feel something I hadn't expected. I started to feel chosen. Not because I was young, not because I fit anyone's perfect image, but because I was showing up, learning his world, adjusting my habits, speaking with my hands when words weren't enough. I felt, in a way that is hard to describe, like my kindness was finally being seen as strength rather than softness. There were tender moments that still flash in my mind like little film clips. A rainy afternoon when we sat in my apartment and I taught him how to feel the vibration of music through a wooden tabletop, just as he'd described. I played an old jazz record and watched his fingertips rest lightly on the surface, eyes closed, a small smile forming as if the rhythm reached someplace deep inside him. A Sunday morning at a farmer's market, when I signed clumsily that the strawberries looked good, and he responded with a sign I didn't know. When I asked what it meant, he wrote, "Beautiful, for you." And then there was the night he asked me to marry him. It happened at a beach, because he said he liked the way the ocean looked. Even if he couldn't hear it, he could feel the wind and the spray, and the sight of it made him feel calm. We walked along the shore as the sun lowered. The sand was cool beneath my feet, and the horizon looked endless, the way it does when you're standing at the edge of something you can't yet see. Richard stopped and knelt down. At first, I thought he had dropped something. Then he took a small piece of driftwood and began to write in the sand. "Margaret, will you be my wife?" I stood there, stunned, watching the letters form, watching his careful hands make a question that felt larger than the ocean in front of us. Behind the question, I could see Dorothy's hope, my mother's satisfaction, the world's approval. But beyond all that, I also saw Richard's fear, because in that moment he was offering me not just a ring, but his life as it truly was. I thought about my empty apartment. I thought about the quiet comfort of our written conversations. I thought about how, with him, I felt heard in a way I hadn't realized I was missing, and I said yes. He slid the ring onto my finger, then pulled me into his arms. His hug was tight, almost desperate, like he was afraid I might change my mind. I held him back, feeling something settle in my chest, a mix of joy and responsibility. When we returned to the car, Dorothy was waiting, tears in her eyes as if she'd been holding them back all day. She hugged me and whispered, "You've saved him." I remember the way that sentence landed on me, not like a compliment, but like a weight. At the time, I told myself it was just a mother being emotional. I told myself love was supposed to be a kind of saving. I didn't understand yet how dangerous that idea could be. When people tell you a wedding is the happiest day of your life, I always wonder if they mean the wedding itself, or the illusion you're allowed to live inside for a few hours. Our ceremony was small, tasteful, and, at least on the surface, thoughtful about Richard's hearing loss. Dorothy insisted on hiring an interpreter, a woman with quick, elegant hands who stood near the front and translated every vow into sign language. My mother cried so hard she had to dab her eyes with a handkerchief, and for once, her tears weren't the sharp, frustrated kind. They were satisfied, proud, like she could finally relax. I wore a simple ivory dress and carried white roses. Richard looked handsome in a charcoal suit, his hair neatly combed, his posture just a little too perfect. He held my hands for longer than necessary, as if touching me anchored him. When we said our vows, we did it in a way that made everyone around us sigh. He wrote his on a small card and handed it to me, and I read it aloud so our guests could hear. Then I signed my vows to him, my hands shaking just enough to show I was nervous. People clapped. Dorothy beamed. My mother leaned toward my aunt and whispered something that made both of them smile, and I stood there thinking, this is it. I did it. I made it. If you were a woman of my generation, you understand what that sentence means. It wasn't just romantic fulfillment, it was social relief. It was the end of questions at family gatherings. It was no longer being the single one. It was stepping into a role the world knew how to recognize. The reception was held in a garden behind a small venue in Los Altos. There were twinkle lights strung through trees, a band playing old standards, and Dorothy hovering near Richard like a devoted satellite. She watched every interaction like she was guarding something precious. When people spoke to Richard, they spoke a little too loudly at first, out of habit or ignorance, and Dorothy gently corrected them, smiling as if educating them was her calling. "Just face him," she would say. "He reads lips very well." That night, as I danced with Richard, I remember the odd tenderness of it. We moved to the music even though supposedly he couldn't hear it. He rested his hand against my waist and smiled as if my joy was enough. For a moment, I felt heroic. Like I had chosen love over convenience, like I had chosen depth over noise. I didn't notice then how much of my identity was being built around that story. Marriage settled into our days more quietly than the wedding promised. We moved into Richard's house in Palo Alto, a clean, modern place with high ceilings and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The house had space, real space, after years in my tiny apartment. At first, it felt like a gift. Richard's work was booming. Silicon Valley in the early 90s was like a living engine, constantly humming with ambition. Men in suits and men in jeans talked about software like it was the future written in code. You could feel money moving through the air like weather. I didn't fully understand his business, but I understood the hours. Long days, late nights, travel, phone calls that ended in tense smiles. He told me his company was preparing for big changes. People tossed around words like expansion, funding, offering. It was exciting. It was also exhausting in a way Richard rarely admitted. When he came home late, he'd kiss my forehead, loosen his tie, and sit across from me at the table. I would slide him a notepad, and we would talk in our familiar way. Pen strokes and glances, small smiles, and the quiet scratch of ink. "How was your day?" "Hard. But it's getting better." "You ate?" "Not enough." I worried about him. I cooked more. I packed lunches. I made our home feel like a place he could land. Dorothy praised me for it. "I knew you were the right kind of woman," she told me one afternoon, standing in my kitchen as if she owned it. Some women wouldn't understand what it means to care for a man who has limitations. I didn't like the word limitations. I didn't like the way she said it, like a warning. But I told myself she was old-fashioned. I told myself I should be patient. My own mother, meanwhile, shifted from pressure to commentary. "You're lucky," she said during one of our Sunday calls. "A good man, a good house. Now don't ruin it by working yourself into the ground. A woman needs to know when to come home." I was still working as an architect then. I had projects I loved, clients who trusted me, and a sense of purpose I wasn't willing to surrender just because I had a ring on my finger. But marriage changes the way people look at your time, especially in those days. Suddenly, my late nights at the office were framed not as dedication but as inconvenience. Richard didn't demand I stop working. Not directly. He simply grew quieter when I mentioned deadlines. He would write, "I miss you," in a way that made me feel guilty for having a life outside him. Dorothy would remark, "It must be hard for him, sitting in silence all evening, as if my job were an act of cruelty." And somewhere between their words, my own desire to be a good wife and the cultural noise that told women to make a home their real masterpiece, I began to adjust. I started leaving the office earlier. I turned down a new project that would have meant travel. I told myself it was temporary, that it was a season of marriage settling in. Then, 3 months after our wedding, I found out I was pregnant. I can still see the pregnancy test in my hand, the way the little symbol appeared like a verdict. My first feeling was shock, then a rush of warmth so intense I had to sit down. I had wanted children in an abstract way, someday when the timing felt right. But like many women who built careers, I also carried fear. Fear that I'd wait too long, fear that my body wouldn't cooperate, fear that I'd end up with regrets. When I told Richard, I wrote the words on a card and handed it to him. "I'm pregnant." His face changed so quickly it startled me. His eyes widened and then he smiled, wide, almost boyish. He pulled me into his arms so tightly I could barely breathe. For a moment I felt pure happiness. I felt chosen again. Not just as a wife, but as the future mother of his child. Dorothy cried when she found out. She kissed my cheeks and thanked me like I had given her something she'd been waiting for her entire life. "A baby," she whispered. A little miracle. My mother, too, became softer, almost kind. "You see?" she said. "Everything happens when it's supposed to." Pregnancy, however, is not always the glowing montage people sell you. I was sick. Not the cute kind of nauseous, but the kind that kept me near the bathroom and drained the color from my face. My doctor told me to rest. Dorothy told me to stop working before something happens. Richard wrote, "Please, take care of yourself," so I took leave from my job. At first, I told myself I'd return after the baby arrived. But days passed and my identity shifted in small, quiet ways. My calendar emptied, my professional voice quieted. The house became my world. Dorothy filled the space. She began coming over more often, carrying bags of groceries as if I couldn't possibly manage. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets for efficiency. She left parenting books on the coffee table, passages marked with little sticky flags. She spoke to my belly as if the baby belonged to her as much as to me. "You must eat more protein," she instructed, "and no stress. Stress is poison." I tried to laugh it off. I tried to remind myself she was excited, but there were moments, small, unsettling moments, when I caught Dorothy watching me with a look that felt more like inspection than affection. Richard, too, changed. He became more attentive in some ways, more distant in others. He would rest his hand on my stomach and smile, then turn away as if some private thought had pulled him elsewhere. He wrote fewer long notes and more short ones. Tired, busy, meetings. I told myself it was the baby, the responsibility, the pressure of work. I told myself men sometimes retreat into themselves when life grows bigger. By the time I reached my 6th month, I felt like I had been living in carefulness for a year. Careful with my body. Careful with Richard's supposed disability. Careful with Dorothy's feelings. Careful not to disappoint my mother, who finally had the picture she wanted to show the world. And then came that evening in our kitchen. I remember the way my feet swelled by the end of the day. I remember the smell of chicken sizzling. I remember feeling proud that I could still cook, still keep the house warm, even when my energy ran low. Richard had come home later than usual. He looked tense, distracted, like a man carrying something heavy. I reached for a sticky note and wrote, "The way I always did, the way our life had trained me to do. Red or white?" I held the note over my shoulder, expecting the familiar scratch of his pen in return. Instead, I heard his voice, close, unmistakable, say my name as if he had never been silent at all. When Richard said, "Margaret, we need to talk," it wasn't just the sound that stunned me. It was how practiced it was. Steady, clear. Like a man who had been speaking his whole life and simply decided, until now, not to. I turned slowly, the sticky note still pinched between my fingers. My mind went searching for explanations, the way it always does when something doesn't fit. Maybe he had regained some hearing. Maybe this was a new kind of therapy. Maybe I had misunderstood everything, but his next words destroyed every excuse before it could form. "I'm not deaf," he said again. "I never was." The room seemed to tilt. I remember the hum of the refrigerator, the faint pop of oil in the pan, the way my heartbeat suddenly felt loud enough to shake the cabinets. I stared at his face, willing it to soften into a joke, a misunderstanding, anything. "What are you saying?" I asked. My voice sounded thin, unfamiliar. Richard swallowed. He looked like he was bracing for impact, but he didn't step back. "I'm saying..." I lied. The baby moved inside me, a firm little roll. I put my palm over my belly as if my hand could hold the world together. I had always imagined betrayal would arrive with shouting, with slammed doors, with some obvious villainy. But this came in our spotless kitchen, on an ordinary evening, between a pen and a glass of wine. "You let me believe this," I said. "You let me learn sign language. You let me write you notes. For... how long?" His eyes flickered away for half a second, like a child caught with his hand in a cookie jar. Then he forced himself to look back at me. "Since the beginning." A sound escaped me, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. "Since the beginning," I repeated, tasting the phrase like poison. "Our first dinner, the beach, the wedding, the vows." I couldn't even finish the thought because I suddenly saw the interpreter at our ceremony, hands flying with devotion, translating a performance. Richard's jaw tightened. I didn't plan for it to go this far. That sentence, so casual, so small, made something in me crack. I took a step toward him, not aggressive, but dizzy, like I needed to confirm he was real. "Then why?" I demanded. "Why would you do this? Who does this to another person?" His shoulders sagged, and for the first time I saw panic in him, not the panic of regret, but the panic of a man whose story has slipped out of his control. "I was hurt," he said quickly, like the explanation could act as a shield. before you. There was someone, Julia. She left me. She said I was cold, that I didn't really listen, that I made everything about myself. His voice shook. I didn't know how to keep someone, so I thought if I couldn't hear, people would have to slow down. They'd have to be patient. They'd have to stay. I stared at him, trying to understand the logic of cruelty disguised as vulnerability. So you made yourself deaf, I said, almost whispering, to force me to become the kind of woman who would never leave you. He flinched. I didn't force you. You did, I cut in, and my voice rose. You designed it. You built a cage and called it romance. My chest tightened, the way it does when grief and anger collide. Do you have any idea what it feels like to realize your entire relationship was staged? He looked down at the counter, where my sticky note lay like a piece of evidence. At first it was just a way to protect myself, he said. Then you were kind. You were different. And I kept thinking I'd tell you, you just kept lying, I said. He stepped forward, reaching out as if to touch my arm. Margaret, please, I love you. The word love, coming from his mouth, his real mouth, the one I had watched carefully for months as it formed silent shapes, hit me like a slap. Don't, I said sharply, backing away. Don't say that like it means anything. My eyes went to the doorway, and there, as if summoned by the worst timing in the world, Dorothy appeared. She must have let herself in, as she often did, carrying a small bag of groceries and wearing the satisfied look of a woman who believes she is helpful. The moment she saw our faces, her smile faltered. What's going on? She asked, her gaze darting between us. Richard's face went rigid. Mom. But I didn't let him manage the moment. I turned to Dorothy, my hands trembling so hard I had to press them to my sides. Did you know? I asked her. Dorothy's lips parted, then closed again. She put the grocery bag down carefully, like setting down glass. Margaret, she said softly, you're upset. You shouldn't be upset in your condition. It was such a familiar kind of deflection, concern used as a muzzle, that my anger sharpened. Did you know? I asked again, louder. Dorothy didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked to Richard, and that tiny glance told me everything. A mother and son sharing a silent agreement, a habit of protecting him at the cost of truth. Yes, I breathed, the word leaving me like air from a punctured tire. You knew. Dorothy's voice rose, pleading. I was trying to protect him. You don't understand what he went through. I laughed then, once, bitterly. Protect him, I repeated. And who was protecting me? Who was protecting my child? Richard stepped in, voice urgent. Mom, stop. Let me handle this. Handle this. As if my life was a problem to be managed, I looked from him to Dorothy and back again, and something dawned that made my stomach drop even further. My mother, I said slowly. My mother introduced us. I felt my throat tighten. She knew too, didn't she? Dorothy didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation, the betrayal stacked in layers, husband, mother-in-law, and possibly my own mother, my own blood, standing somewhere behind the curtain, applauding the play. I couldn't breathe. I gripped the edge of the counter, and the cool granite under my fingers was the only thing keeping me upright. Get out, I said. Richard blinked. Margaret, please. Get out, I repeated, and my voice had changed. It wasn't loud. It was final. Dorothy stepped forward. Now, listen. I turned on her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't soften for someone else's comfort. You too, I said. Out, both of you. Richard moved as if to argue, then hesitated, seeing something in my face that made him stop. He nodded once, stiffly, like a man forced to accept consequences he never fully believed would come. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but they looked more like frustration than remorse. You're making a mistake, she whispered. No, I said, and the word came from somewhere deep. The mistake was trusting either of you. When they were gone, the house didn't feel quiet the way it used to. It felt hollow, like all the air had been sucked out. I stood there for a long time, staring at the sticky note that asked a simple question about wine: red or white. It struck me how much of my life had been reduced to small, careful accommodations. How many choices I thought were mine had actually been engineered. Then I reached for the phone with shaking hands and called the one person I knew would come without judgment. "Catherine," I said when my sister answered, my voice breaking at last. "I need you." She didn't ask for details. She didn't tell me to calm down. She simply said, "I'm on my way," and hung up. After that, I called my mother. She answered with a cheerful tone that now sounded grotesque. "Margaret, how are you feeling? Is the baby—" "Did you know?" I cut in. There was a pause. Too long. A pause filled with calculation. "Know what?" she asked, but her voice had shifted, cautious now. "Richard," I said, each syllable heavy. "He isn't deaf. He never was. Did you know?" Silence. Then softly, my mother said, "Margaret, don't do this right now." That was her confession, dressed as advice. Something inside me went still. "You knew," I whispered. "Listen," she began, a familiar tone rising, the tone she used when she believed she was right and I was being unreasonable. "He's a good man, he's successful, he treats you well. So what if he—" Exaggerated. Men do foolish things when they're afraid. Exaggerated. As if my marriage was a minor embellishment. I felt tears spill down my face, but my voice stayed steady. "You sold me," I said. "You sold me to a lie because it fit your picture." "Don't be dramatic," she snapped, and there it was. My mother, the one I knew. I hung up. When Catherine arrived, she took one look at me, pale, shaking, one hand on my belly, and she wrapped her arms around me. I pressed my face into her shoulder like I was a child again, and the sobs came hard and unstoppable. In the middle of it, I remember thinking one simple, terrifying truth. I was 6 months pregnant. I had stepped away from my job. The man I married was a stranger, and the people who were supposed to protect me had helped him build the trap. In the days after Richard's confession, time didn't move the way it used to. It didn't flow. It lurched. I stayed in that house, but it no longer felt like mine. Every clean surface looked staged. Every quiet corner felt like it had been designed for someone else's comfort, not my safety. I slept in the guest room with a pillow wedged behind my back and my hand on my stomach, counting the baby's movements the way you count breaths when you're afraid of the dark. Catherine moved in without asking. She arrived with a suitcase, a stack of groceries, and the kind of determination that made you feel less alone simply by standing near her. "You're not doing this by yourself," she said, and that was that. The first morning she made coffee and opened the curtains wide, as if sunlight could push betrayal out of the walls. She didn't pressure me to talk, but she didn't let me disappear either. When I tried to insist I was fine, she gave me a look that said, "Don't insult me." Richard called, again and again, sometimes through the relay service, sometimes by leaving messages on the answering machine. I didn't pick up. I didn't listen to the messages at first. I couldn't stand the idea of his voice filling the rooms. Dorothy showed up twice. The first time, Catherine answered the door and stood in the doorway like a gate. "Margaret is resting," she said. Dorothy tried to peer past her. "I need to speak with her. This is family." Catherine didn't budge. "Family doesn't do what you did," she replied, calm as stone. Then she closed the door. The second time Dorothy came, she brought a casserole like we were in some church basement after a tragedy. I watched from the hallway as Catherine took it without thanks and set it outside on the porch. "You can leave food," Catherine said, "but you can't come in." Dorothy's face tightened. "You're poisoning her against us." "No," Catherine answered. "You did that." That was the first time I realized how badly Dorothy needed control. Not love, control. If she could manage the story, she could manage the pain. But the story had slipped out of her hands, and now she was trying to wrestle it back. As for my mother, she called with the same kind of insistence she'd always used when she believed my emotions were inconvenient. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said on one voicemail Catherine played for me when I finally agreed to hear it. "You need to think about the baby. You need stability." Stability. The word sounded almost funny in that moment, like calling a house stable while the foundation is cracking. One afternoon, Catherine sat at the kitchen table with me and slid a small piece of paper across the surface. It had a phone number written neatly in her handwriting. "Who is this?" I asked. "A therapist," she said. "My friend at the hospital recommended her, Dr. Patricia Chen." I shook my head. "I don't need a therapist. I didn't know what I needed. Justice, air, a way to rewind time." Catherine leaned forward. "Maggie," she said, using the name she'd called me when we were girls, "you've been living inside someone else's lie. Your mind is going to keep trying to make it make sense. A professional can help you untangle it, and you're carrying a child. You don't get to collapse." It wasn't harsh. It was love spoken plainly. 2 days later, I sat in Dr. Chen's office, hands clenched in my lap so tightly my knuckles hurt. The room was quiet, warm, filled with plants and soft light. Dr. Chen was in her 40s, calm, with a voice that made you feel like she had seen every kind of human mess and wasn't afraid of yours. She let me speak without interruption. I told her about the notes, the sign language classes, the wedding interpreter, the kitchen. I told her about Dorothy's complicity, my mother's betrayal, the feeling of being a fool in my own life. When I finished, my throat burned and my eyes were dry in that strange way they get when you've cried too much. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "Margaret," she said, "what you experienced was a long-term deception that can create symptoms that look like shock. Your nervous system is trying to protect you now." I stared at the carpet. "It feels like I don't know who I am," I admitted. "Like everything I did, every choice, was based on something false." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, then asked a question that caught me off guard. "In the time you were with Richard," she said, "what did you love?" My first impulse was anger. Love? As if it mattered, as if it wasn't contaminated. But she waited. Patient. I swallowed. "I loved how calm it was," I said, surprised by my own answer. He couldn't interrupt me. He couldn't talk over me. He had to look at me when I spoke. I felt heard. Dr. Chen nodded again, as if confirming something. "So, part of what you loved," she said, "was being listened to, being taken seriously." I felt my chest tighten. I thought of my mother's constant criticisms, the world's constant measuring. I thought of boardrooms where men smiled politely and then turned their attention to the loudest voice. I thought of how, with Richard, I had felt safe enough to soften. "He made me feel like my kindness was valuable," I whispered. Dr. Chen's eyes stayed steady on mine. "And now," she said gently, "you feel like that kindness was used against you." It was the most accurate sentence anyone had spoken to me since the kitchen. The therapy didn't fix me in a day. It didn't erase the betrayal. But it did something important. It gave me language. Instead of spinning in a storm of shame, I started to see the shape of what had happened. Richard hadn't just lied about being deaf. He had created a role for me, patient, devoted, grateful to be chosen, and he had watched me step into it. He had let me build a whole self around the illusion. Dorothy and my mother had cheered from the sidelines because the role made their lives easier too. And once I saw that, I stopped asking, how could I have been so stupid? And started asking, why were they so willing to sacrifice my reality? A week after my first session, Richard sent a letter. A real letter, on thick paper, sealed in an envelope like it was from another era. Catherine opened it first, just in case it contained something that would upset me too much. When she handed it to me, her face was hard. I sat at the table and read his handwriting. He wrote that he was sorry. That he had been terrified of being left. That he had convinced himself the lie was harmless because it made him better at being a partner. He wrote that he truly loved me, that he had never intended to hurt me, that he didn't know how to undo what he'd done. At the bottom he wrote, in a sentence that made my stomach twist, "I'm willing to do anything to make this right." For the first time, I didn't immediately rip the paper. I didn't throw it away. I simply folded it back into the envelope and stared at it, trying to decide what right could even mean. That evening, after my second therapy session, Dr. Chen asked, "What do you need in order to feel safe?" Safe? Not happy? Not forgiving? Safe. I thought about my baby. I thought about being alone. I thought about how the world treats a pregnant woman with no husband and no job, how quickly people assume the worst, how freely they offer advice as judgment. "I need control," I said finally. "I need the truth. I need boundaries." So Catherine and I wrote a list, not on a notepad for a deaf man, on a clean sheet of paper for a woman reclaiming her life. Richard could come back to the house only if he agreed to individual therapy and couples counseling. Dorothy was not welcome in my home. Richard would sleep in a separate room. There would be no touching without my consent, no pretending this was normal. And if he ever lied to me again about anything, he was gone. When Richard arrived to hear these conditions, he didn't come in with confidence. He came in as if he expected to be hit. Catherine stayed in the living room like a silent witness while I sat across from him at the table. It was the first time I had ever heard him speak in my home without disguise. His voice sounded ordinary. That was part of the horror of it. How ordinary evil can sound when it's wrapped in a calm tone. "I'll do it," he said when I finished reading the conditions aloud. His eyes were red-rimmed, his posture slumped. "I'll do all of it." I didn't answer right away. I watched him carefully, the way I used to watch his lips. Only now I was watching for the man underneath, the one I had never truly met. "This isn't forgiveness," I said quietly. "This is a temporary arrangement so I can get through the pregnancy without chaos." He nodded quickly. "I understand." Dorothy, when she heard she was barred, called me at the house and left a message that Catherine erased before I could hear it. Later, Catherine told me Dorothy had said, "She's destroying our family." Our family. As if I had been anything more than a role. That night, Richard moved his things into the guest room. He walked past me with the hesitation of a stranger. The house felt different with him in it again, not comforting, not complete, just tense. Like two people sharing space after a car accident, waiting to see who can still walk. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house, the pipes, the settling wood, Richard's footsteps down the hall. For months, I had believed silence was the shape of our love. Now I understood that silence can also be a hiding place, and as I felt my baby shift and press against my ribs, I made myself a promise in the dark. I would not raise a child inside a lie. Not again. Not ever. Our daughter was born on a gray morning in late spring, the kind of day California pretends not to have. Cool, overcast, the sky heavy with quiet. Labor doesn't care about your marital status, your heartbreak, or your plans. It is a force that arrives and takes over. When my contractions started, I wasn't thinking about betrayal or therapy or Dorothy's angry phone calls. I was thinking about breathing. I was thinking about getting through the next wave. I was thinking in the simplest, most animal way about survival. Catherine drove me to the hospital. Richard followed in his own car because I refused to sit beside him. It wasn't petty, it was protection. I needed my body to feel like it belonged to me again, and proximity to him still felt like trespassing. In the delivery room, Richard stood near the wall, not at my side, not in the role of devoted husband. Just there, present, quiet, unsure of where he fit. A nurse asked him if he wanted to hold my hand. I said, "No," before he could answer. The nurse didn't argue. She simply nodded, professional, as if she'd seen 100 versions of complicated families. When the pain peaked, Catherine leaned close and counted breaths with me. Her voice was my anchor. In between contractions, I caught glimpses of Richard's face. He looked pale, terrified, and small. Not the man from the beach. Not the man in the wedding suit, not the confident businessman. Just a man watching the consequences of his choices enter the world as a child. When our daughter finally arrived, everything else fell away for a moment. She was slippery and pink and loud in the way only newborns can be. Her cry filled the room, sharp, insistent, undeniable. I remember thinking, with a strange, sudden clarity, that she had already done something I hadn't been able to do. She told the truth with her whole body. I am here. I exist. I need. They placed her on my chest. Her tiny fingers curled around my skin as if she recognized me. I stared at her face, her small nose, her clenched eyelids, the soft fuzz of hair on her head, and something broke open in me that wasn't grief. It was love. Pure. Uncomplicated. Mine. "We'll call her Claire," I whispered, my voice cracking. Catherine smiled through tears. "She's beautiful," she said. Richard stepped forward slightly as if pulled by an invisible string. The nurse asked, "Dad, do you want to cut the cord?" I didn't want to give him anything that felt symbolic, but the cord was already cut. The connection had already been made, not by romance, by biology, by reality. "Let him," I heard myself say, and it surprised me. Richard's hands shook as he took the scissors. He looked at me once, silently asking permission. I gave a small nod, not warmth, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. He cut the cord and then stood there, staring at Claire as if he couldn't believe she was real. Later, after the chaos settled and the room quieted, he asked in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, "May I hold her?" I watched him carefully. This wasn't about his feelings. This was about my child's safety. "Yes," I said finally, "but sit down." He sat in the chair, and a nurse placed Claire in his arms. He cradled her awkwardly at first, then adjusted, instinct kicking in. His face crumpled. Tears slid down his cheeks and dripped onto his shirt. He didn't wipe them away. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, looking down at her. "I'm so sorry." I didn't respond. His apology wasn't for me in that moment. It was for the life he had almost begun under a false foundation. The weeks after childbirth are often described as tender, sleepy, full of joy. Mine were tender, yes, but not in a soft way, in a raw way, like skin that has been torn and is learning how to heal without splitting again. Richard stayed in the house, still in the guest room. He made food. He washed bottles. He took night shifts when I was too exhausted to keep my eyes open. Sometimes he moved quietly through the kitchen at 2 a.m, warming milk, and I would sit at the table watching him like a stranger in my home. We started couples counseling with Dr. Chen. Those sessions were not romantic. They were forensic. We took apart our story piece by piece, not to admire it, but to see where the rot had been hidden. Dr. Chen asked Richard questions that made him squirm. "What did you get from pretending to be deaf?" she asked one afternoon. Richard swallowed, staring at the floor. "Control," he admitted, voice hoarse. "I got control of the pace, the attention, the way people saw me." "And what did Margaret give up?" Dr. Chen asked him. Richard looked at me then, really looked. For the first time, I saw him face the full consequence. "She gave up. Her autonomy," he said quietly. "Her reality." Dr. Chen nodded. "And you," she said to him, "are going to spend the rest of your life proving you can live without control, because parenthood doesn't allow it." At home, there were small moments that surprised me. One night, when Claire wouldn't stop crying, I sat on the edge of the bed with tears of my own running down my face. I hadn't slept in 2 days. My body still ached. My mind felt like cotton. Catherine had gone home to shower and rest, and for the first time I was alone in the house with Richard and the baby. Richard came into the doorway and didn't speak right away. He simply held out his arms, palms open, in a quiet question. "Do you want me to take her?" I nodded, too tired to argue. He took Claire and walked with her slowly, humming, a low, steady sound. He hummed because he could, because he always could. And yet, as he hummed, his eyes stayed on Claire's face with something that looked like awe and fear tangled together. The baby quieted. In that moment, I felt something complicated rise in my chest, not forgiveness, not love, but the awareness that my child had a father who could be present if he chose to be honest. Dorothy, meanwhile, didn't go quietly. She sent letters. She called. She showed up at the house twice, once with a stuffed animal and once with a bag of baby clothes, as if gifts could purchase access. Catherine screened most of it, but I eventually told her, "Let me handle it." One afternoon, I opened the door myself and saw Dorothy standing there, eyes sharp, chin lifted. "I have a right to see my granddaughter," she said. "You have a desire," I corrected, my voice calm. "A right is something you earn by behaving like a safe person." Dorothy's face tightened. "I protected my son." "You protected his lie," I said, "and you were willing to sacrifice me to keep him comfortable. That's not protection. That's selfishness." Her mouth opened, ready with arguments, but I lifted my hand. "If you want a relationship with Claire," I continued, "you will do therapy. You will acknowledge what you did, and you will stop treating me like an obstacle. I am her mother." Dorothy stared at me as if she didn't recognize me. Perhaps she didn't. The Margaret who signed vows and smiled through discomfort would have softened. The Margaret holding a newborn in her arms had become someone else. "I won't be spoken to like this," Dorothy snapped. "Then you won't be in our lives," I said simply, and I closed the door. As for my mother, our relationship changed in a way that never fully returned. We spoke eventually, but the trust was gone. She tried to justify herself. She claimed she thought the lie was temporary. She claimed she believed Richard was good for me. She claimed she was trying to help. But when I looked at her, I didn't see help. I saw a woman who had valued an image more than her daughter's reality. Over time, my mother learned to be careful around me. She learned that I would hang up. She learned that I would not accept the old scripts anymore. But the warmth we once had, thin as it sometimes was, never came back in the same shape. The years after Claire's birth were not a straight road. There were periods when Richard worked hard and showed up, and I could almost breathe. There were days when I caught him slipping into old habits, avoiding, withholding, trying to manage my feelings with careful words, and I felt the anger surge back like a fever. Therapy became a long, slow education. Richard had to learn how to tolerate discomfort without hiding behind performance. I had to learn how to trust my own instincts again. That was the hardest part. When you've been deceived, you start doubting your ability to see truth, and that doubt can poison everything. But I did something that helped. 6 months after Claire was born, I returned to architecture. Not because I needed a paycheck, Richard could have supported us financially, but because I needed myself. I needed to rebuild the part of my identity that existed outside marriage and motherhood. I took on a small project first, then another. My hands stopped shaking when I introduced myself in meetings. My voice found its steadiness again. And with that steadiness came clarity. I told Richard one night after Claire was asleep, "You don't get to be my whole world." He nodded, looking ashamed. "I know," he said. And the fact that he could say "I know" out loud, honestly, without notes, was a strange kind of progress. Years passed. Claire grew into a bright, stubborn girl who asked hard questions. When she was 5, she asked why Daddy didn't sleep in Mommy's room for a long time. When she was 10, she asked why Grandma Dorothy wasn't around like other grandparents. Children sense truth, even when you try to hide it behind polite stories. We told her age-appropriate versions. We didn't lie. We chose language that protected her innocence without insulting her intelligence. When Claire was older, an adult in fact, we told her the full truth. She cried. She was furious. She looked at her father with a kind of disappointment that wounded him more than any argument ever could. Richard didn't defend himself. He didn't minimize. He simply said, "I did something terrible. And I've spent my life trying to become a better man than the one who did it." Sometimes that's the best you can do. Stop digging, stop lying, stop asking to be spared consequences. In time, we had a second child, a boy we named James. By then, our marriage had transformed. Not into a fairy tale, but into something sturdier, something made of truth and work rather than romance and performance. On our 10th anniversary, Richard asked me if I would renew our vows. I didn't say yes right away. I sat with the question for weeks, turning it over, not because I was punishing him, but because I refused to make symbolic gestures lightly anymore. When we finally did it, it wasn't a big event. No interpreter, no audience hungry for a moving story, just a small gathering in our backyard, Claire and James nearby, Catherine smiling with her arms folded. Richard looked at me and said with his own voice, "I won't promise perfection, but I promise honesty, even when it costs me." And I said, "I promise to live in the truth even when it hurts, because our children deserve a home where reality is safe." If you're listening to me now and you're older, you know this. Life rarely gives us clean stories. Most of us don't get love without mistakes, family without disappointment, or trust without scars. The question isn't whether we get wounded. The question is whether we choose to heal with our eyes open. Today, I'm 68 years old. Our children are grown. The house in Palo Alto has changed. New paint, new furniture, a quieter kitchen. Sometimes I stand at the counter and remember that sticky note, red or white. It seems almost laughable now that such a simple question could be the doorway to such an enormous betrayal. But that's how life works. The biggest turning points often begin with ordinary moments. Richard is older too. He moves more slowly. His hair is gray. There are days I look at him and still feel a flicker of the old pain, because healing doesn't erase memory. It simply teaches you how to live beside it. But there are also days I see him with our children, hear him laughing with Claire, watch him helping James fix something in the garage, and I think people can change, but only if they stop protecting the lie and start facing the truth. And as for me, I learned something I wish I had known at 32. Being loved is not the same as being chosen. Being chosen can happen for selfish reasons. Being loved, truly loved, requires respect for your reality. If you've made it to the end of this story with me, thank you for listening. I wish you good health, steady peace, and a home filled with people who tell the truth. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel, and it means you'll be here with us the next time life hands us a story we didn't expect.